Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dan, and this is the Having Initiative podcast. Today's episode is titled Self-Reliance, and this is one that I recorded once, and it was, I followed my outline, but I came up with a lot of new stuff on the spot, and so I really had to come back and refine it. So it's self-reliance, but we're going to talk a lot about society. Now, on that vein, I have another podcast where I planning on talking about society, so I'll constantly be flirting with that line. So one thing that I see a lot of today is that people comment on how some people are suffering and having bad conditions and others are thriving. And they argue that they are going after something benevolent in an attempt to alleviate the suffering, but they blame the suffering on someone else's success. And there's, as a result, this big individual versus collective argument going around. Which one? I mean, we should help the individual because they are part of the collective, or the needs of the collective come first at the expense of the individual. But mainly focused around how to fix the problems, the suffering that people are having, we need to kind of fix things from the top down. And so this podcast is mostly about argumentation for we need to focus on the bottom as individuals and not so rigidly. I mean, basically the very last point I make is that solutions come from the bottom up, not the top down. And that's a tricky topic. So regardless of politics or what our views on society are, what they should be, or morality, what we think things are, should be, something that I don't think we're doing enough of is encouraging the individual to rely on themselves to solve their problems. Now, I know I'm going to get immediately a lot of backlash about that, but if you listen to my very first episode, I talk about how people will go to incredible lengths to find out information about trivial information like Pokemon or celebrity status or things on Tumblr, that kind of thing. But they won't apply that to their own lives, or they'll say, I'm doing everything I can. And there have been times in my life where I thought I said to people in my life, I am at a dead end. There's nothing else I can do. Something else external of me has to change. And they said, well, I see you did this incredible feat with that, thing that you like. Why don't you apply that elsewhere to your subject that you're failing right now in school? I talk about in what we know and what we don't know about how there is a math problem and people oftentimes would give up whenever they couldn't see the answer immediately, but all the information, well, not all, but for one of the things they were looking for, all of the information was right in front of them. And I don't remember which podcast I talked about it in, but I talked about a time where I was working on budgeting with a short film, and I used basic algebra 1 to figure something out, and everyone was amazed. I'm like, guys, you all, when we went to the same school, you all know this. This is not reinventing the wheel for some reason, and now you are amazed that I did it. And so in that vein, this episode is largely about how we're not encouraging the individual to use what's in front of them, and we need to make that kind of a standard. And I'm not saying that we, quote unquote, as society shouldn't help individuals. I'm definitely not saying that. Charity is part of that. But I'm saying the solutions to fixing these things, people are offloading, in the name of compassion, offloading them off to something else. And I'll elaborate on that. But first, a quick story. I was rewatching the movie Count of Monte Cristo with Jim Caviezel, and I read the book a while back, and there's some similarities, but some big differences. So that's why I know the movie better, so that's why I'm referencing it. But this character, Abbe Faria, I believe that's how you pronounce it, says he's in prison with this guy Edmond Dantes, Jim Caviezel, and Richard Harris's character has been digging a tunnel out, but he went in the wrong direction. So now he needs Edmond's help to dig in the right direction. And he says, if you help me out, I'll give you something that can never be taken away from you. And Edmond says, freedom? And the Abbey responds, no, freedom, as you have noticed, being thrown in prison unjustly, can be taken away from you. I'm going to give you knowledge. And he's got various books there. I'm going to teach you about philosophy, science, mathematics. And then Edmond says to read and write. And the gobsmacked Abby's like, well, of course, I'm going to teach you that. But while they're digging out, the Abbey teaches Edmond a lot of stuff about economics, languages, Italian, and among others. And it takes several years for them to dig out of this prison. And also how to fight, because Edmond was a commoner who wasn't given he wasn't a soldier, he was just a laborer. And his friend who betrayed him was, I believe, part of the aristocracy and was given formal education. So he's like, okay, when I get out of here, I'm going to get revenge and I'm going to fight. I need to learn how to fight to do that. So the Abbey reluctantly teaches him. And near the end of as they're digging out, their tunnel they're digging collapses, and the poor Abbey is crushed. And he gets dragged out of there, and he's dying. And he tells Edmond, okay, there's a huge treasure outside of here that I know about, nobody else does. Here's a map to get to that. Use your skill to find it, because he can't explain everything about the map in the few moments he has left of life. And he says, once you get that gold, use it for good, not revenge. And then Edmond talks about how he's going to do that. And then in the story, Edmond gets out of prison. He finds the gold and is wealthy, like incredibly wealthy. He becomes the Count of Monte Cristo as an alias. But the thing is, after he gets out, he gets taken in with a bunch of smugglers, and it takes him 3 years before he can go off on his own to go and find that gold. But as the time passes, it's heavily implied, both with how he gets with the smugglers and with the passage of the 3 years, it's implied that he is a very smart and resourceful individual in a way that he was not before he got thrown in prison. And both before he gets the gold and then after he gets the gold and he starts using his machinations, while he has resources, he was smart about how he used them, and he was smart about surviving those 3 years on that smuggling boat. And as the priest said before he passed away, use your skill to get out of there, because since he taught him also really how to think during their time in prison. And so I have another podcast planned about intelligence and education. And there's a huge debate on, can intelligence be taught to an extent? And so the thing I'm arguing is, however much intelligence you have and however much it can be nurtured, or however much information can be learned, that's something that I've talked about several times in this podcast already. But use what you have. And for self-reliance, that's what I mean. Use what you have before you start blaming society for your failings. And I don't see enough people doing that. I see people, I'm working hard, but they aren't working smart, that kind of thing. So without further ado, the main topics for this podcast are a part of society, personal growth, and responsibility. So here we go. So, a part of society. As an individual, you are a part of society. And what is society? That's for another podcast. But people argue that as individuals, we have a responsibility to help others, which I agree with, but not just help others, but help quote unquote society. And society has a responsibility. If it is a just society, it has a responsibility to take care of those within it. And that's where the argumentation is about. There's a lot of blaming the failures of individuals on society, and there may be truth to that. But people, particularly when they're arguing politics, they say, well, above all else, our objective should be to help others. Now, there's a lot of people agree with the sentiment behind that, but they disagree with how we go about helping others, and that's a complicated issue. And to recap, I'm all for helping individuals and trying to fix quote unquote society's problems. But when people are arguing about how they're going to help society, or they say society has failed individuals, or you should pay your taxes for the good of society. With a lot of these things, I notice the argumentation is absolving the person who is making these arguments. That individual is absolving them of their responsibility to help others by blaming it or associating it with this thing called society, which they themselves can't fully define. And so what is being passed off as compassion is, at times I witness, it is a shirking of responsibility. While they argue that we should help the disadvantaged, they themselves won't help the disadvantaged themselves. And so another thing I want to talk about is how people argue society is failing individuals. People see problems. They say those people are suffering. They're doing subpar. Something should be done, but nothing is being done, and so society has failed them. And if you disagree with the person on this thought process, then you must not be empathetic or compassionate. Or if you were empathetic or compassionate, you would understand their viewpoint, and then you would agree with their course of action to fix these issues. That's something that I see a lot. Now, that notion there's truth to it, but it isn't the notion that society is failing individuals if people aren't, thriving, or some are thriving and others aren't. That notion isn't terribly well thought out. And by saying society is failing people, it's a desperate attempt. They don't fully understand, I guess, reality or all the ways that things could go wrong. And so by attributing this to society, they are giving voice to their personal tragedy that they can't attribute cause to. And sometimes I see this with body image, of how society gives certain positive or negative things, and that's a complicated issue. But that's for another podcast. But sometimes, yeah, we can see with how society can fail individuals. We all know there are bad laws that are stupid, or if we work at a company, there are bad policies. Like someone will argue, how can this restaurant throw this food away whenever there are starving people? Why don't you give the leftover food to the starving people? Well, the problem is that people will exploit that, and then the business will go under because their excess food is being given away freely, and people are living off that instead of buying their food. Or if it's in the trash, or if it's going to go in the trash, like it's something at someone's dinner plate. If a customer eats that food and gets sick, then they sue the restaurant, and now the restaurant went under. So the restaurant's policy has to be throw away the food. And so, yes, there are times where there are bad policies that have bad results, or I guess bad policies cause a elimination of efficient asset distribution, that kind of thing. And so with the individual, we see there's oftentimes people arguing that some are failing and others are thriving, and they say society has created a way that has allowed this to be possible, and it's not natural. The natural state is for everyone to be thriving. And I heard people argue about, we need to find out what causes poverty. And then the retort to that, which I agree with, is poverty is the natural state of existence for humans. I love those I know they're reality TV, and there is scripting and some presentation going on, but Naked and Afraid, Survival, people are stuck on a desert island and not given anything, and they're supposed to survive, and they're miserable. And the thing is that right there, misery within nature, how it's uncaring and not, nurturing, that's the natural state of humanity. So poverty was the natural state of humanity. And they argued we should find out what causes prosperity. And there's, a lot of stuff that goes into that. But oftentimes what I've seen with prosperity is that it doesn't happen on its own. Someone has to make it happen. And sometimes it's relying on themselves, and sometimes it is the group relying on themselves and not waiting for a handout from somewhere. And earlier in my show, I talked about full potential and how people weren't living up to their full potential, and then they turned their lives around and did something incredible. And oftentimes it wasn't like with the Count of Monte Cristo, where they stumbled at the point where he stumbled upon a huge amount of gold. it was that point in the Count of Monte Cristo where after he had been forced to think and learn, that he made better decisions with what was in front of him and he navigated the world that way. And a lot of the people who turned their lives around, they just started making better decisions. They didn't become endowed with something supernatural, or they weren't granted a huge amount of money. And that's something that stops a lot of people's like, wow, if I won the lottery, then I could fix all this, that kind of thing. And in terms of, money, yeah, you probably could at least fix those issues. But if your problems were the result of your behavior, then money won't fix them because you'll just make them again with more money. And the people who turn their lives around, oftentimes they just they saw, whenever they committed themselves to doing better, they saw what was in front of them, but they had just written it off and then they used it. Kind of like what I was talking about with that budgeting issue about how, okay, this is just if we look at this problem, it's a basic math equation and you solve it and that's how much money you need. So when we're talking about how society fails individuals, society, again, that's loosely defined, and I'm going to do a podcast on it, can have trends and conventions, but the larger it gets, the less we can rely on top-down rigid mechanisms to solve every problem within. Now, in school, you've probably, in like biology class, you probably saw a diagram of something that goes like this. It shows an atom, and then a bunch of atoms make a molecule, and then a bunch of molecules can make a cell, or an organelle inside a cell, and then a bunch of organelles inside a cell make a cell, and then a bunch of cells together make a tissue, and a bunch of tissues make an organ, and a bunch of several organs make an organ system like the cardiovascular system, and several organ systems put together make a person. And the society, whatever the heck that is like that, which is how it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's a lot of moving parts to it. And so how is the person supposed to solve the problems of the specific molecule that's going on inside them? Or one or a couple of cells, and we're not talking about like a mass like cancer, because that's a bit more straightforward, or certain issues that are going on with atoms. Now apply that to the equivalent of society. That's the issue with trying to fix things top down with society, is that it gets harder and harder to see what's going on that small level and the various interactions and basically pinpointing solving them. So real quick, a slight tangent, because I've been talking about society a lot, and I'm going to talk about the individual, but not so much about self-reliance. The group or society can't save every individual. And there's times where, for the greater good, we have to intentionally not try and fix every individual. We have a standard, and the people that rise to it, and those that don't. And we have to move from there. Now, sometimes people don't succeed because they've been misbehaving, or there's been many reasons for the misfortune. But the argument against that is that we should be compassionate for them. There's this argument that if people aren't thriving, it's solely because of some external factor, and that we should be compassionate and find out what that external factor is and fix it, and then they will thrive. Now, because I've made a lot of argumentation with people struggling versus people who are successful, let's take a look more on the successful side. I mentioned earlier that I've been paying attention to soccer, and the national team in the World Cup, they're only allowed 22 or 23 players, I believe. Let's say that we have 100 individuals who want to be on that national team and have worked their butts off toward it and have done everything that they can to be ready for it. No smoking and drinking and no excessive partying, and always exercising every day and working on skills, that kind of thing. And this group of 100, we've already filtered out the 500 other people who said they wanted to be on the national team, but didn't, put forth the effort, that kind of thing, or didn't go all the way. So just by nature of having that national team, we're going to have to cut 77 people. And we want that national team to win. So if we're in charge of that, we have to make some hard choices about the 77 that aren't going to be there. Now, that's a sport, but there are times in, a lot of people can't emotionally cope with the idea that there are no win scenarios, and we just have to salvage it as best we can. And so at times we have to accept that there will be a certain level of people not getting what they want. Now, this ties into the greater good argument, how, we see some people struggling and some people succeeding, and we kind of say for the greater good of those suffering, we should take from those who are being successful. And there's a lot of different situations. People argue, I don't mean to belittle that argument. It is more complicated, and there are arguments for it. But the problem is the greater good is people use it to argue for improving society, but people who have been arguing for the greater good have often caused huge problems with society. Like, the greater good is that all individuals should thrive. Therefore, we should try and help the people who are less fortunate. But another argument is that the greater good is bigger than the individual, and therefore we can't accommodate the individual, and we have to let them fall aside, that kind of thing. And so with the greater good, it's a double-edged sword, and it's not an absolute argument, just something to bear in mind. So that's the end of my tangent. Sorry. I'm going to go back to the individual now and talk about personal growth. So with personal growth, only you can make it happen. Now, when we talk about a lot of things that talk about with personal growth, or I guess empowerment, is education, personal habits, skills, decision-making, and health. And we want to improve all those things, but the only way that you're really going to get, or any individual is going to get better at these things, is if they take ownership of their personal education habits, skills, and so forth. Now, with education, yes, you could get into a good school and you could get a good personal mentor, that kind of thing, but you have to make it happen. And even before you get to those things, as I mentioned in my opening episode, you have access to more information readily than ever before than any point in human history. So don't attribute your full lack of knowledge to not having a teacher. But even if you go to like a nice school or whatever, a teacher can only present information and try and make you do stuff, but there is this process that is going on entirely inside of you, and that is your education that is going on right there. And same thing with a good teacher. Like someone like Ms. Nuriagi says, there's no such thing as a bad student, only a bad teacher. Well, actually, there is a bad student, a student that doesn't do a damn thing the teacher says. And maybe he may attribute that to a bad teacher, but it is a two-step process, and we want to be the good student. And being the good student is on us. With education, there's no way for someone to copy what is in their brain and paste it in yours. And so the next best thing we can do is that person can represent what is in their brain, their understanding, through some means, visuals or words, that kind of thing. But it's up to the individual to observe those things and come up with their own understanding that occurs in their brain. Now, with making good habits, someone could force you into good habits, but those don't typically stick. And someone says, I want to make better decisions. I need a mentor, someone that will guide me. And sometimes they'll go to the point of where, you know what, you decide what I'm going to do, and then you write it down and I'll do it. But with the best mentors, they're going to get you to start doing that for yourself, because they can't be there for every decision and they can't be there forever. And if they do make every decision for you, it's just a Band-Aid on the problem. And as for learning new skills, yes, you can learn from watching other people and having them teach you and having them guide you, but don't discount your own personal discovery in learning things, because just as a teacher can only present information and then you have to learn it on your own, you can explore and experiment and learn things on your own. Like Tony Hawk. Tony Hawk at his peak would not win any professional skating competition in today's day and age. Now, what gave him all the notoriety back in the day was that he experimented and developed and did new things that nobody else was doing. That's how he got to the point where he's at, where everyone said, oh, Tony Hawk, he's that amazing skater. And then people saw him, what he was doing, mimicked it, did it again, and then they did their own experimentation and went forward and eventually surpassed what he was doing. And that's where we're at now. So before you label your lack of skill or education off of a lack of someone being there to tell you how to do it, remember there was once a point in time where nobody knew how to do anything. No one had any skills. They just experimented and discovered on their own. So you got to take care of that in your own life. And as far as making good decisions, like someone said the adage, other people can't learn your lessons for you. And that was kind of about like life lessons about, they talked about with a situation that happened in like Sex and the City or several, like he's just not that into you. You saw it in Sex and the City. You saw that movie. He's just not that into you. But yet this woman who knew all these things from other places still chased after someone who wasn't into her. And that's what she meant by other people can't learn your life lessons for you. And so the way that you start making better decisions in your life is by making your decisions and then seeing how that turns out for you. Now, yes, of course, you can, watch other people and try to learn from them, but you won't fully understand the decisions they make and the consequences until you start making your own decisions. So be brave and take ownership of your decisions. Now, with personal growth with health, only you have control over it. Again, we could use the metaphor of, let's say someone locks you away and they lock you in a room and they only put certain food in there and you eat it, and they will only pick the optimal food for your health. That will only work so far. And honestly, most of us can't have that happen. So there comes a point where, yes, we can, talk to a nutritionist or that kind of thing and read articles and learn about what we should be eating or how we should be exercising in the same vein, but only we decide what we eat and only we decide how much we exercise. And so we have to take ownership of that. I know a lot of people who say, okay, I'm going to get in shape, New Year's resolution, that kind of thing. And they go there and they try and run the treadmill for 30 minutes. They nearly have a heart attack and then they never come back. And they said, well, if I had a trainer, they would fix this problem for me. They would teach me the way. Well, you have to discover the way. And maybe part of discovering the way is getting a trainer. But even then, you have to do what they tell you when you're not in session with them. Because unless you're going to have a lot of money to spare and you can pay them to be there for every single exercise that you do or that you need to do, yeah, there's going to come a point where you have to take your own agency in your health. Now, with these examples of personal growth, I'm going to wrap it up with a story. There's often times where there's a successful athlete and they have a good trainer. And there's the commentators on the news that will say, and they'll get flack for saying these things like, oh, that trainer made that athlete. And they'll get into a huge hubbub. And sometimes there'll be, with the trainer and the student, there'll be debate about how, okay, yeah, that person was really talented, but it wasn't until that trainer taught them certain skills and made them do certain things that they became extraordinary. Or it could be, yeah, they have a trainer, but that athlete was the one who had the drive to make it happen. And they were really doing a lot of work that the trainer wasn't giving, not because they were a bad trainer, but just because their knowledge was limited. So with this scenario, there'll be debate as to who did it in terms of that athlete's success. And I mean, maybe a trainer is super smart or whatnot, but even if they are super smart and know things that the athlete doesn't, the athlete had to make it happen. And this just isn't for athletes and personal trainers, that kind of thing. It's for anything where someone is mentoring someone and another person is doing the directions of the mentor. Just something to bear in mind. So now, with empowerment is often the word that we use for personal growth and getting people to be responsible for their personal growth. And as I mentioned, it's not that I believe that the only way to fix any problem is from the bottom up. I believe we are not nearly putting enough effort into solving things from the bottom up. And so with empowerment, that's what I mean about how we should empower the individual. Now, with politics, there are people who argue, I will create policies that will make an environment that will empower others. But a lot of the things that they're trying to fix, I mean, we would have to use the example of that educator who or not the educator, that mentor who dictates everything that a person does, or the nutritionist that only allows them to eat certain things. And even then, like, they may reject those policies on their own. But so in terms of politics, the only way you could possibly do that through a political means is by having that, and no one is arguing for that because it's pretty much impossible. And those problems, since we can't create policy to fix them, and not just that we can't create policy to fix them, is that we have to get people to, if we want to empower someone, the way that we empower them is by getting them to start doing those things on their own. And sometimes it will be that they will start taking advantage of things that are in front of them. And then, yes, sometimes it is, okay, we get them better access to more resources. And the empowerment is to stop waiting for someone to save them. Now, a quick story here. I've heard a lot of people talk about, they look at Japan and certain aspects of that. Like, there's memes going on about how at schools they will take a period where they tell kids to clean up their classroom, and there's a little picture of kids, dusting and sweeping and mopping, that kind of thing, and that it teaches them good habits about helping others. And people are like, we should do that over here. But the problem is people don't. The people that argue for that, they don't do it themselves. That's the irony of this. And I do believe in, that kind of thing. But the other thing is that sometimes they'll point to certain social problems, and they say, okay, or social programs that aim at addressing certain problems. And they say, since they put money into those social programs, that shows that their society cares. And you know what? There may be truth to that, and there may be nuance in that, but it may also be that the people who argue for these things, as I mentioned before, are outsourcing their personal responsibility to help others or to be their own thriving individual and offloading it onto society, whatever that is. Now, one thing that I wanted to argue with Japan is that discipline and basically being a good citizen is something that is highly stressed there by, it's not, I don't think it's written into law, but is very much culturally present. There is an individual responsibility for you to improve yourself so that you can be useful for society. And the people that look at those memes and say that we should be more like Japan, and then they don't act more like Japan because they ignore that discipline. And oftentimes they are arguing against people who say personal self-reliance or discipline, whatever you want to call it. That is what we should be encouraging. They're like, no, we should encourage just people to be more compassionate and care about each other, whether that is for helping people or through legislation. And they point at the discipline, but they don't point at the culture that really enforces it, and that it not enforces it, but it develops it. It strongly encourages, I guess you could say, the individual to take that upon themselves. Now, oftentimes when people point at those things, like in Japan, they teach kids how to clean, so that way they have a cleaner society and they don't have to hire as many janitors. That what they're saying is they wish that people around them would make them more disciplined instead of using their own initiative to do it themselves. Because as I mentioned, a lot of the people that point to those things don't try and implement them here. They just say, I wish this would happen. And as for Japan, and a lot of people point to that as like certain aspects that they see on the internet, usually just a small meme, and say, we should be more like that. And they say, look, everyone is thriving over there. I've spoken to some people from Japan, and depression is actually very high over there because there is that ideal citizen that is, competent, and by being competent, they are being helpful to others by not having to be a drag on society and eating up resources. And there is a stigma against relying off of social, unless you're old, kind of relying off of social programs, that kind of thing. And depression is very high because almost nobody can live up to that ideal citizen, that discipline and the responsibility. And it's not just about jobs or that kind of thing, or doing a good job. It's also just about manners, that kind of thing. And people also look at Japan like, oh, they're so polite over there. I wish we had a society that enforced that instead of, being polite themselves. And there's the movie Demolition Man where there are these stations that it can say, "Are you feeling down? Push this button for basically a self-esteem boost." And they press it and it says, "You are a great person," or that kind of thing. It's the mood lift button. And that's kind of an example about how certain problems can't be solved with social programs or legislation because it's it has to organically occur within the individual. There's some things that you can't just put a bandage on. It's more complicated than that. And so with empowerment, regardless of the situation around you, I've just seen that so many people aren't using what's at their disposal. Now, the most successful people, yeah, they are. That's kind of how they got there. But I've worked at, physical labor jobs that could be considered a dead end. Some people worked there for a while they got some work experience and then moved on to better things. And others kind of just stayed there. And why they didn't, because they were competent, they were smart, at least in certain ways, but they didn't move out. And I never found out the reason. And some of them were just wrote themselves off as, this is all that I can do. And I got stuck in a job like that for a while because I was afraid of failure and success at the same time. So when we talk about empowerment, I just really want to stress the point that I believe it comes from the bottom up. Now, I've kind of been talking about this the whole time, but the last topic I have here is responsibility. Now, again, think of the name of this podcast, Having Initiative. When we talk about personal responsibility, people almost seem to treat it as optional. And now I hear a lot of arguments for we as a citizen or a part of society, that kind of thing, we have a duty to others. And we have a moral duty to help others less fortunate than us. And we have an ethical responsibility to do this or not do that. And sometimes people will start browbeating about how, like, you have a responsibility to help others, or we have a responsibility to help others. Again, we is something that it includes themselves in it, but at the same time, they are not referencing themselves. They are referencing something that is bigger than them. So at the same time, it is not them. And sometimes people will argue with, religious reasons, and people without religious reasons will say it's common sense, or it's just kind of a natural part of the universe, things that they can't prove. It's like Terminator 2. You can't run around killing people. Why not? Well, you just can't. It's hard to explain. So they treat the responsibility to help others and to alleviate the suffering around them, or attribute the suffering of others as a lack of responsibility from society. They treat that as something that is inherent and a part of the universe, but they don't seem to treat personal responsibility as something that is also inherently it's inherently your responsibility to try and take care of yourself and use everything at your disposal. And they don't like to be criticized about that. They treat that personal responsibility as optional, or that it's a given. If everyone is trying their best, and if they are failing, then it's not because of them. And it's easy to blame it on something else, or a lack of opportunity, or a lack of a teacher, or a bad hand you were dealt with. And you know what? Someone may have all of those things. I mean, may have a lack of opportunity, may have had something bad happen to them, may have had a bad hand dealt to them, but only they can turn that around ultimately, regardless of what is given to them. So, yes, I strongly believe that we do have a duty to others. And one of the things that we should be encouraging is to get other people to acknowledge that they have a duty to themselves, and they owe it to themselves to start fighting smart and hard. Now, in that vein of getting people to start fixing their issues, a word that is thrown around a lot these days that I see is we shouldn't judge people. And I agree with that, but there's this line between judgment and acknowledging the truth. In my first and second episodes, I talk about the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. That's for kind of situations. But when we look at people, we have to observe what is in front of us, and then we have to go based off of that. And if someone isn't fighting for themselves, we got to call it out. That is a duty that we owe to them. And of course, like, are you calling it out because you like to, you know, put down other people, or are you calling it out because you want them to succeed and you got to get them to stop doing that? So if you really want to empower someone, get them to start taking care of themselves and improving themselves. And if there are other circumstances, then yeah, of course, offer aid and that kind of thing, or help them get out of it. But first, you got to take a look, are they really trying? Because if they're not, giving them stuff won't suddenly, for the most part, won't suddenly inspire them to do better. You know, if their problems were because of their decisions when they had no money, give them more money and they'll still make bad decisions. That's typically how it goes. So be like William Kamkwamba, as I mentioned in my very first podcast about how he had to drop out of school, but he sought out education anyway, as after he was helping his family on the farm. And then he built a wind turbine. So wrapping this all up, how far we go as individuals or as a society is going to it's going to be contingent upon how we rely on ourselves to fix our own problems. Now, I have my own political views, and everyone else does, but at the end of the day, the only thing that you have for sure is yourself. Only you can make your goals happen, and you are far too complicated for society to be able to fix everything about you. And then in terms of society's problems, society is made up of all of us, and we have to be doing our part. So I mentioned earlier that I love desert island shows and other survivor, in nature shows where people are, dropped in the middle of nowhere and given nothing. Because that's the way things are supposed to be, quote unquote. Because that's nature. That's what we were born into. I hear a lot of people say that society is cruel and unforgiving because it allows people to suffer. Well, you haven't seen anything until you've tried living in nature without the assistance of society. And there's that movie Into the Wild, which is based off of a real person. In the movie, this man goes and lives in the wilderness and ultimately doesn't make it home. He dies out there. And it glorifies his experiences in nature. And I'm sure the man witnessed some great things and loved parts of it. But I read the note that he left on he found a bus in the wild, and that's what he was living out of. I saw the note, and he wanted to live. He was trying to live, but he was dying and too weak to do anything else. And the people that found him just missed him by 19 days. And they saw they know of his experiences because he journaled them. But as time went on, his journals got less and less detailed, and he started writing more and more about how he was feeling like crap. So yeah, that was a bit of a tangent when I'm talking about self-reliance. Sorry for talking about Into the Wild, but it just, so many people say that if people are struggling, it's because of a failure of society. And it's not natural, and society is artificial, so our natural state should be thriving in bliss. Well, I talked about Into the Wild because the natural state is struggle and hardship. So just something to think about. And I do have a lot more to say on, I guess, problems and that kind of thing, but that's for another day. So that was just wrapping up a couple of things I want to talk about self-reliance. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this. And now it's time for a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for listening to the final episode of season 1. Sound like a broken record, but season 2 is almost here. This episode was delayed because there were technical issues with it. But yes, there's probably going to be a week off between this episode and the start of season 2. I'm really excited for it. I remember with season 1, this episode, I got a bit more passionate but that wasn't necessarily a great thing because I felt like I lost certain through lines through the podcast. I was going off on too many tangents. And season two, as a whole, I feel better about it. I go into much more depth and talk about things that I wanted to a lot more clearly, and also at the same time while keeping it on topic. So I'm really excited for you guys to get a listen to that. Also, I'm almost done designing a new logo. I have it like 90% of the way there, so hopefully you should see that uploaded on all the social media before by the time season 2 comes around. So once again, thank you for listening to this episode, and if you've listened to any of the others, thank you for that. If you'd like to support this YouTube channel, please like, comment, and subscribe, and possibly share with someone that you think would be interested. And with the things I mentioned here in this episode or any others, please leave a comment and let me know. And so, yes, once again, thank you very much, and I hope to hear from you again. Take care, everyone.